Good morning, everyone. Um, it's a pleasure to be here again for another year. And since 2016, when we began this project, people ask, conviviality seems just a nice word for something really hard, which is domination, which is violence, and all these phenomena that characterize our society. And our answer was always, this is conviviality. We have to cope with that. How do we cope with inequality, violence? How we cope with injustice and all this? This is a way of framing conviviality so that everyone may find her place in the center, in this common endeavor. And in the case of relationalities, it's difficult to say relationalities. Uh, it's the same thing. It's a dimension of conviviality that involves violence, that involves brutal phenomena of the social world. And we are here to discuss with you some of it, some of this nasty characteristic of relationality and of conviviality. And I'm very pleased to be in this panel, and we will follow the order that is in the program. So Beatriz de Oliveira from the University of São Paulo will be the first. Please, Beatriz.
Do you want? Yes, if we can change.
Switch.
Não, acho que eu prefiro o passando, se não for. Good morning, all. First of all, sorry, when you're almost 8 months pregnant, the times are a bit different. So sorry, I was in a hurry to arrive here. But first of all, I want to thank you for for this invitation. I'm really glad to be here with Mecila and also Cebrap and have this opportunity of exchange. So today I'm gonna present you a part of my doctoral research and also a paper that I'm hopefully this year will be published on the Political Psychology Journal. And the title is The Construction of Threatening Others, Discourses and Agendas of the Brazilian and German Radical Right. So I'm Beatriz Bezing. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for the Study of Violence at the University of São Paulo. And I'm currently funded by FAPESP and developing a new research. So I will try to make this blend between my doctoral dissertation and research, but also something that I'm calling a new research agenda based on what I found during my research. So basically, I will give you a short introduction, then I will try to bring a bit about this concept that I'm proposing like a hermeneutic category, that's plural radical right. Then a bit about the methodology, because it's important to have an idea where the data comes from and how this happens. I spent 2 years in Germany between the Humboldt University of Berlin and Goethe University of Frankfurt, and 2 years here at the University of São Paulo. Later, I will present the discourses and agendas that I found and that I want to present. And then two mechanisms that's called othering and authoritarianism, focusing on the differences, how those discourses and agendas have been analyze it in the Latin American context and also in the European context, and then I will talk a bit about this new research agenda. So, introduction. I spent some years working as a project coordinator at a favela called Heliópolis. Here is one of the biggest favelas here in São Paulo. And I worked with projects aimed at youth. And I started to notice that some of these young people that I work several years with start to present some new interest in politics, but this start mainly with the interest mainly on the ideas of meritocracy and be a boss and not be an employer. And this start to move forward to some to adoption of some conservative agendas. So I start to ask myself how this process happened and how can I analyze it. And we found a temporal coincidence that the most part of analysis of what has been called mostly here in Brazil as the expansion of the new right, and mostly in Europe can like a radical right, happens in Brazil and Germany. The most part of analysis pointed to the year of 2013. In the case of Brazil, we're talking about the journals of June 2013. And in the case of Germany, we're pointing to the creation of Alternative für Deutschland, or the AfD. So, though this temporal coincidence, of course, gained my attention, so I decided that maybe I can look to this process and ask myself, is this true? This starts, or it's a gateway or a point um, um, that we can analyze this year and how this happened. So the objective of my research was analyze and compare meanings, identities, and discourses involved on youth activism in the radical right of Brazil and Germany. At this point, I was open to the literature, and so I addressed them as new right, ultra right, radical right. So, one of the first things that I gonna discuss is that I found this need of have a concept to use during my research. It's not a perfect concept, but at least put together all the traits that I found during my research. So I work with interviews, biographical interviews with young people between 18 and 32 years old. And during 2 years, I used Instagram groups. I add more than 2,000, oh, sorry, 200 groups that can be classified or has some traits that I will consider as part of the this what I call plural radical right. And then I made hundreds and maybe almost thousands of invitations. So, and I talk about my main idea that was okay. We have a stigmatization about the youth involved on this kind of movements. I want to hear you and I want to know more. And I was interested in their trajectories, but I use it, as I mentioned, biographical interviews. So, so what I call it a plural radical right are groups, movements, parties, and actors that share those traits. They do not recognize the state as a regulator of inequalities. They target the constitutional right of minorities. They are providing collective identities. They use strategies of counter publicity to reach the public sphere, and they are mobilizing youth actors. So this part was important to me. I was looking to these groups and seeing that they were interested in mobilize youth actors. So this was a common point between. I'm not saying that the majority of the support to the radical right are young people. So this is important. What I'm mentioning is at some point, I realized that have youth on board was really important for those groups. So I was interested, okay, and what is the interest of those young people in on those kind of political movements? So the theoretical approach was power analysis and discursive interpellation. the studies of authoritarianism in Latin America and the studies of othering and cultural racism in Europe, and also the studies of the new right in Brazil and radical right in Europe. So I was interested in this intersection between, I'm a psychologist, I think it's important, but after I made my master in sociology and political science, but I come and I was interested in the intersection of two processes, what we call a discursive interpellation that usually come from institutions, but also the processes of subjectivation, how those young people understand themselves and how they build their political identities. So to look at this intersection, I chose two processes. So I developed 16 biographical interviews. I did not work with sample because it's a qualitative study, but I looked for um, different ethnicities, different regions. For example, in Brazil, I work with North Brazil and also South of Brazil. In Germany, I work with East and West Germany. So I try to have this, but you need to of course, but a difficult is because if you have 16, I just work with people that accepted to work with me because it's not easy to get to these people. That's why it's not common to find this kind of qualitative research. So with this, I select 12 biographical thematic interviews for analysis. I work with reconstructions. This come from the interpretative German sociology that basically is to rebuild the histories in a temporal order, even so they didn't do during the interviews. I want to tell you a history about it, and later I apply a critical discourse analysis. So I don't know if I should read for you, but this part of the reconstructions, unfortunately, I don't have the time to go deeper on it because I'm gonna focus on the part of the critical discourse analysis. But I put some titles that I think that can share the main idea that appears. And basically, I found different meanings for political participation for those young people. And that was something that was a first result of my analysis of my research, that you have like different meanings for political participation, and also different agendas that works as a gateway to get into these movements. So I think we just want to take care of our country. My values do not come from the right, but from the Bible. I don't owe nothing to the feminism. I could have been any criminal. I consider this a process of self development. I'm just defending a noble ideal. Conservatism is not an ideology, it's a way of life, a line of tradition that continues into the future. Society is getting crazier and crazier. So basic on that, I cannot go deeper, but I want to present the general thematic categories that I proposed. That was feminism and the moralization of crisis. So there was present this discourse that was not just like we need to preserve the traditional family, but the family is an institution under attack. And all the idea of crisis, they have always this idea, okay, we're facing a crisis, but we have specific groups that are causing them. We have threatening others that are causing our crisis. The anti-feminism and masculinism would be interesting, especially after this series Adolescence that called about this. I also have like young people involved on red pill movements that also was part of the interviews. The difference between Brazil and Germany, with the presence of neo-Pentecostalism, and in Germany, the idea of a cultural Christianity that's not a practice, a religion practice, but more the idea of we have a common origin that come from Christianity. So the abuses and uses of the past, the construction of threatening others that I want to discuss further, society madness, so this idea that society is crazy, society is facing degeneration, and that's why you need to be urgent and have radical action. Then the concepts of freedom, this idea of social justice as a coercion, and finally, and that's important, there are traits of resistance, mainly in the idea that those young people also can perceive the marks of power relations and say, okay, maybe this is not fitting this discursive system that it's presented by their movements. So I found also these traits of resistance. But what I want to discuss with you is because two agendas stood out in both countries and they are different. It's the only agenda that you won't find in Germany in general. Of course, you can find, but it's not a majority. That is defense of civilian gun ownership here in Brazil. So the most part of my interviews mention that they want that they think civilian gun ownership as a right. And you're gonna, in the case of Germany, the agenda of anti-immigration, the defense of stricter laws against immigration. So quickly, I'm gonna read just one quote that I think it's important. To deal with this problem, we need to end the disarmament statute and our civilians, because the state is omnipresent, it's flawed. So give the people the right to legitimate self-defense. For me, in my view, it's not that it will end violence, but at least an innocent person, a family man, can survive, can face it, can take care of his family, and try to at least mitigate the violence. Aside from public policies like stricter laws for criminals and offenders, also civilian gun ownership, which for me is important for the protection of the law-abiding citizen. And in the case of anti-immigration in Germany, we all want this country basically to save it from the people who are leading us to an energy crisis caused by us from, I don't want to use the word, especially from a flood of culturally strange people, eine Überflutung von kulturfremden Menschen, where we are led to believe that they could solve our shortage of skilled workers when they themselves cannot easily write and speak their own language. So I consider that we have different agendas, but we have a common mechanism or a common root that I call the building of binary social representations. So from one side, you have this idea of the bandit and the criminal in the Brazilian case, and in Germany, this idea that was building as the culturally strangers that is related to the people that immigrate, and especially non-specialized immigrants. This appears. And from in the other side, you have the law-abiding citizen or the idea of the normals. And I don't know if you are aware, but one of the main slogans from AfD, it's Deutschland aber normal. That is basically, okay, we are the normal people. And I also found another research that was made by Roy, and she interviewed women from the AfD and also from the party, the radical right party in Austria. And she found that all the women usually say, I'm just a normal woman. So this idea, what it's about to be the normal, and this normal is building based on this difference. So what is in common in this mechanism is the representation of the others as those who breaks the norm and are uncontrollable, and the idea that they abuse or are defended and protected by the state. And this can be in Latin America, we are using more the key analysis of authoritarianism. In the case of Europe, you find more like the idea of othering. But I'm interested because those both processes produce an intersection between the idea of securitization and racism. And what is securitization? Is a process of politicization, considering that security is the move that takes politics beyond the established rules of the game and frames the issue either as a special kind of politics or as above politics. or the exact definition and criteria of securitization is constituted by the intersubjective establishment of an existential threat with a salience sufficient to have substantial political effects. So the idea I was interested, how do you break the democratic agreement or pact? So this kind of discourse that you have a security problem is the kind of discourse that allows you to say maybe we don't need to follow the liberal democracy and our agreements because this is a special situation. And I found that both agendas in both countries are working as this justification. And I want to quickly present what I'm interested right now. It's the first time I'm presenting this, but I want to share this idea that how we're dealing with a plural radical right that's not that we have like we call new right or radical right, but we're talking about different agendas and different groups that I'm calling right now clusters based on the idea that come also from these people that working with digital networks. And my idea is you have these different clusters. Right now I identify 7 of them, but of course this is open, and the idea is that we maybe can reply this for other contexts. This is for the Brazilian context. So inside of the plural radical right you can find libertarian and liberals, masculinists, traditionalists, patriots and pro-civilian gun ownership, evangelicals, and and now not just neo-Pentecostals, because there is a huge discussion, and I developed a research for the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, and I found several Baptists churches that are also. So I'm using now evangelicals, anti-feminists, and also monarchists. I interviewed two monarchists, and I put some of the core ideas that can show these intersections. And I want to understand how this can come together next year in our election year. So I'm interested, okay, you have like those different agendas, you have like those people identify themselves if you talk to them, and mostly I did not have the time, but I interested mainly on youth, but they gonna say, okay, I'm here because I'm pro-gun. Not exactly, I don't feel a Bolsonarist, for example, because for many time, like the most part of the research was just so focused on the idea of the support. But the last part. So right now this is a first diagram that I'm developing and I want to propose. But the idea is this can give some kind of orientation. I won't go, but that later I can share with you. And this research agenda is based on this idea, as I mentioned before, how you can produce discourses that allow you to say that, okay, maybe we need to break the democratic agreement or pact. So how you can use this. And in the case of Europe, this intersection between crisis, the new normal, and the anti and post-democratic action is one of the proposed research agendas. So getting to my end, my final remarks is I want to continue highlighting the plurality within the radical right and investigate them in their specificities. So this idea is how can we look at them and uncover this idea that we're not talking about a congruent group. So how we can address this in their specificities, continue investing in comparative research because I think it's important if we have the chance. I know that's not easy because we depend on funding and other stuff, but as far as you can, I think it's fruitful, and also expose the intersections and discourses that underpin anti-democratic practice. So I hope that I could cover. It's a lot, but we can discuss, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Hello, welcome everybody. I think this will be a slightly different subject now. And so I thought perhaps we might have the discussion about your presentation first. I'm not sure. No, just continue.
Yeah, just continue.
Okay.
This is how we.
Okay, good. So let me perhaps make a small introduction before I start with what I have to say. Let me first say where I come from. I'm Karolina Wigura. I'm a historian of ideas and sociologist from Poland originally. I work somewhere between Poland and Germany with particular stress in my interests on three subjects, namely collective emotions, Eastern Europe or Central Eastern Europe, and populism. I also consider myself to be a kind of a bridge between academia and think tank world. In both my countries, so in Poland and Germany, I have both academic and NGO obligations and engagements. And what I have for you today is also a concept. It's like your concept. I would like to think about it as an sensitizing concept. So it's still a hypothesis. It's still something that is being proved, and I would love to discuss it with you. And the concept is called post-traumatic sovereignty. So when I heard the title of this panel and that we are going to discuss relationalities with regard to recurring violence, I thought post-traumatic sovereignty might be the best concept to present here. Basically, it is a hypothesis that a recurring occurrence, a recurring experience of vanishing state vanishing from the map, and violence that occurs after this vanishing of the state might deeply influence not only collective emotions of a given society, but also its political rationality. And it might serve as a hypothesis which explains the logic and way particular societies react to new threats and new violence occurring in international relations. So what I have to say today is based both on a book that has already been published. It's in German, Posttraumatische Souveränität. The book is basically a reaction to the Russian full-scale aggression against Ukraine in 2022 and the reaction of East Central Europe to this aggression on the basis of how post-traumatic sovereignty works. This was a book written by me and Jarosław Kuisz. And now, as you will see at the very end, we are also expanding the search, trying to treat East Central Europe as a case study, and not only as the only case of post-traumatic sovereignty. We also research and write about other countries which cultures are affected with a recurring violence, a recurring fear of losing one's statehood. So this would be for the introduction. Now, I would like to start not with East Central Europe, but with Taiwan. There was, in 2022, on a sunny day in spring, a very particular demonstration in Taipei. There was a group of activists, Taiwanese young people, who decided to dress up as if they were victims of a military aggression. And they decided to use sounds of bombs falling down that were recorded from loudspeakers. And they had slogans like "Stop Russia," "Stop War," etc., etc. And this is so interesting because the Taiwanese, the inhabitants of Taiwan are basically 8,000 kilometers away from Ukraine, and yet they thought there is something extremely relevant in what was happening to a small Central and Eastern European country at that time. So this Taiwan case will come back during my talk today. Obviously, this shows that we are dealing here with a very global character of Russian war against Ukraine. Obviously, we know that the war has had profound consequences for the global economy, for the way the grain shipments were structured from Ukraine. It was very relevant for the way of living and the quality of living of people in the West. But we, with Jarosław Kuisz, basically were focusing on something else. Something really important revealed itself in 2022 in Eastern Europe, and it was also a particularly interesting time. In 2022, basically, it seemed as if the relevance of the region was not there anymore. This region was very relevant after 1989, when the communism, Russian style, basically came down to an end, and the new striving of East Central European countries to democratize and to create market-free economy, those were relevant cases for people around the world. But in 2022, basically, East Central Europe didn't seem very relevant. It seemed that it was a region where at least a couple of important countries were already experiencing liberal democracy fading, with Ukraine, of course, striving towards liberal democracy, but with Hungary, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, and my country, Poland, basically going into a completely different direction, namely national populism. And yet, in 2022, it seemed that this particular region brought a very relevant reaction to Russian aggression against Ukraine. Namely, you might say that if in February 2022, the West, consisting of Western European countries, but also partly the US, reacted to the outbreak of the full-scale war with a shock. It was a shock for many, many people. East Central Europeans seemed curiously reassured. Not in the meaning that there was no fear, of course. There was a collective, quite visceral fear that is visible in our research. But at the same time, there was something about saying, yes, this was coming. We could recognize that before. So there seemed to be some reassuring knowledge coming from the country's experiences and knowledge of Russia that allowed them, as many of them claimed, to understand what this war meant and where it could lead. Let me just say that it was not only this strange feeling of reassurance, but also there was a quite different definition of the war. For the West, the war in Ukraine basically is a disaster for the people of Ukraine. It's a comeback of war straight into the European continent. And there was a very strong conviction that if there is a responsibility of the NATO countries and the Western countries, it is the responsibility not to escalate the war. Because the biggest threat is, of course, that the war spills over the Ukrainian border and that probably this might become a nuclear war. So this was, at the time, the definition of the West and this war. Eastern Europeans basically defined the war completely different. For them, it wasn't an event, it was a process. The process didn't start in 2022. It didn't even start in 2014 with Crimea. It actually started with Chechnya in the beginning of 2000s. So this was a process. And this was rather, I'm lost in the notes. And this was rather a next step of a completely nightmarish program of Vladimir Putin and a new comeback of imperialist Russia, it was also something, because it was derived, the knowledge was derived from the past. It was also something that looked like a prognosis of what might happen. To quote the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, "Our neighbor's problem today will be our problem tomorrow." Or she also said at a different occasion, "Our neighbor's house is on fire and our house is going to be on fire very soon." What the East Central Europeans were referring to were of course events of the 20th century. What was very often referred to was 1939 and the Hitler-Stalin Pact. So this is a pact that basically was a pact officially of non-aggression between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, but it also had the secret part about dividing East Central Europe into two. So, referring to 1939 and the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 2022 in East Central Europe, in Estonia, in Latvia, in Poland, in Ukraine, was very, very, very strong. So this was something that in these public debates occurred very strongly. As early as in March 2022, the Lithuanian's Prime Minister Ingrida Šimonytė said Russia's invasion was predictable. And she was not alone. Basically, many actors, and we were researching on the political actors' interventions and public speeches throughout Eastern Europe. So you had Russian and Belarusian dissidents, Ukrainians, the Balts, Georgians, and many other political actors basically saying that the West was ignoring them and their knowledge about Russia was basically ridiculed as being Russophobic. Obviously, after 2022, a certain break in the understanding of Russia and Ukraine came. Yes, it is enough to quote Ursula von der Leyen, who already in 2022 said that the most important lesson is that we should have listened to our friends from Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, the Baltics, Poland, etc., etc. But our subject is a little bit different. We wanted to know where this particular knowledge was coming from. How come East Central Europeans were so sure about that they know what was happening? So our argument is that East Central Europeans and their position on Russia is a very good example of how historical and geographical heritage looms large in political and cultural habits, and how a recurring and persistent character of violence may affect not only collective identity, emotions, but also collective rationality. What perhaps I should point out is that the case of Central and Eastern Europe is a history that in some cases dates back to 300 years. 4 centuries, East Central Europe has experienced the effects of Russian imperialism, from Tsarist Russia to the Soviet Union. Many countries throughout the region had their independence stamped out, their populations decimated, their societies oppressed, and their cultures marginalized. So what is this? We claim that post-traumatic sovereignty is 2 things. First, it's a very strong collective emotion. We argue it's a kind of fear. What is rarely mentioned in East Central Europe, one understands the notion of sovereignty different than in the West. So suffice to say, for the West, for the Western European, sovereignty is a guarantee of stability. For Eastern Europeans, sovereignty is a trauma. Sovereignty is an experience of recurring loss of statehood, and loss of statehood is almost always connected with mass violence. So Hitler-Stalin Pact is just one example of that. Just to illustrate that, in the beginning of 2000s, when the current and former Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski was commenting on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, he actually said, this is Hitler-Stalin pact. So you can see how this collective emotion, how strong it is also in the public debate. I should perhaps also share a few words about trauma and how we treat it in our research. We basically derive the definition of trauma from two sources. First, we work on the Bassam van der Kolk's definition, which situates trauma not as something that actually happened in the past, but the discourse that is created about trauma today. So there is some knowledge about the past, but what is important is how this is interpreted and how this is implemented into the collective societal identity. So this is point number one. And point number two is, of course, a very seminal book by Didier Fassin, The Empire of Trauma, where he shows how this notion, how exceptionally effectively this notion might be used in collective identities research and in social and political psychology. So this is about trauma. And just one concluding remark, because I think I shouldn't be too long. East Central Europe has been for us, of course, a fascinating case study to research and to reflect on. And Post-Traumatic Sovereignty, this initial project, was aimed at understanding better what is common in the political rationality of this region. But also we believe that the region may serve as an important case study of a yet bigger phenomenon, and this is what we are doing now. So in our second book, which is now being written. So first, our argument is that the emergence and consolidation of national identity in the context of a significant political event that threatens to recur, so for example, losing one state and mass violence connected with it, so this takes place probably not only in East and Central Europe, but also around in other places across the globe. I started today with the wave of empathy in Taiwan, but Taiwan is actually not the only case study that could be brought up here. South Korea, Ethiopia, Namibia, those are all countries that might be referred to when it comes to fears of losing sovereignty and the consequences of it. This is point number one. Point number two, with the new Donald Trump's administration in the US and with the demands towards Greenland, Canada, or Mexico, we could also observe a wave of fear of losing sovereignty that was spreading from country to country and from region to region. Here, it is an extremely fresh phenomenon, so it's very difficult to research on that, but let me just say that Central and Eastern Europe might serve as a valuable source of knowledge. Thank you very much. I will be very happy to hear your questions.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Pedro Dallari. I am the Dean of the Institute of International Relations of the University of São Paulo. And I don't know if I can add something on the subject of this seminar. I was here because of the insistence of my fellow colleague, Samuel Barbosa. Thank you much. And I want to thank the Mecila and Cebrap for this opportunity. I am a professor of international law. Worst, I am a practitioner of international law. and I am much more an attorney than an academician in this field. And in this sense, my perception of the violence in the international field is related, of course, with the knowledge of international law, but also with my practical experience, what is not even something good for someone that is trying to understand the whole scenario. I worked as an expert for the Organization of American States on the conflict between Colombia and Ecuador in the 2008 when Colombia invaded the Ecuadorian territory to fight the FARC group, and after that I worked also as an expert for the European Union Institute of Security Studies, the IESS, in the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt to study and try to advise the process to democracy in that countries. More recently, I was the coordinator of the Brazilian Truth Commission here in Brazil. So my experience is very strongly based on this concrete contact with violence in the international field. And this is why I don't know if I am fitted to, as my prestigious colleagues, to deal with the subject of this panel. The question that is important for me, based on the problem put it to this panel, new faces of violence, is to understand if the new international conflicts reveal structural exertion of the regime established in 1945 to control the use of the force, or are they isolated events incapable of reversing a trend of legal regulation of the use of force in international political relations that had been consolidating slowly, but since the end of the late 19th century. Let me put in other words. Armed conflicts, especially those with characteristics of civil wars, have not ceased to occur since the advent of the United Nations regime on the use of force in 1945. However, some recent conflicts have signified a change in this paradigm. The invasion of Ukrainian territory by Russian troops in 2022 constitutes a war unleashed by a state that is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So something that is quite strange, because the Security Council is exactly the organ of the international regime of the Earth's use of force that is in charge to maintain peace and stability in world relations. Also, and this invasion was with the aim of conquering the territory of the invaded state, what is explicitly forbidden in the United Nations Charter, that on Article 2 denies strongly the legality of the occupation of foreign territory. So Russia, a member of the Security Council, invaded Ukraine in order to have territory for itself from Ukraine, what is an absurd on the ground of the legal regime. Also, the present conflict in the Middle East, centered in the Gaza Strip, is more violent and long-lasting than previous conflicts involved the same actors. It's much of, no, it's more of the same, but in a more strong, with more violence, with more longevity than other occasions. No? So there is something new in the scenario. The problem or the question for the academicians and also for humanity is to know if the legal regime will resist and will have some kind of possibility to control these facts, or this means the end of the international legal regime of the control of use of force, and we are beginning a new era that nobody knows what will happen, because with the advance of technology, intelligence, artificial intelligence, nuclear, the possibility of use of nuclear weapons, the absence of control of the use of the force can have some consequences that can be definitive for the perspective of the resistance of the existence of the human species. No, the world will not end, but humanity can end. The dinosaurs were extinguished. Why not the human being will not be extinguished? No, this is something possible. The answer of this question presupposes an examination of the historical evolution of the normative framework applicable to armed conflicts, the legal discipline of war and the use of force, which has been addressed more systematically by international law since the second half of the 19th century, underwent significant evolution through the 20th century. It's important to note that the construction of this legal framework was strongly influenced by public opinion, as we are talking about relationalities. No, it's not. It was not just a task or an objective of governments or states, but opinion, public, influenced a lot in the construction of this framework. In Europe, with the memory of the two world wars, the public opinion in Europe supported very strongly the building of a legal framework for peace, because they suffered a lot with the two conflicts. In the United States, mainly after the Vietnam War, that affected very strongly families and young people and universities, and this was very important to support North America, not only the States, but also Canada, which is a very important country in the building of the peace-keeping system of the United Nations. No, so if we go behind non-governmental organizations participated strongly also in the process of drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights between 1946 and 1948. We every moment listen about the role of Eleanor Roosevelt was very important, of course. But the labor organizations of America participate a lot in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So civil society was there pushing the system, pushing the building of the system, because they suffered concretely with the problem of the absence of legal rules for maintaining the peace. This helped to build two dimensions of the regulation of the use of force, which in Latin is known as ius ad bellum and ius in bello. Ius ad bellum, the law of war, concerns the regulation of of war, thinking about the legally valid possibility, the right to use force. And the second dimension, the jus in bello, deals with concerns the regulation of the action of belligerent forces during an armed conflict, the use of chemical weapons, the use of mines, the use of nuclear weapons. And on the 20th century, there was progressively the building of legal frame to control, to restrain the use of this kind of arms, exactly because of the technological development that put in risk the survivance of humanity with the development of this kind of technology. When Napoleon Bonaparte crossed the Alps in the beginning of the 18th century, the 19th century, end of the 18th century, the technology was almost the same that Hannibal used in the Carthaginian wars to cross the same Alps. Hannibal made it with elephants and Napoleon Bonaparte with horses, but it was almost the same. 100 years after that, the scenario changed completely. No? The technology used in the wars made the 19th century horrible on the aspect. If we think about the American Civil War, where almost more than 10% of the population died in the wars, it was something incredible, no? Or also the wars in the Central Europe that created that made the creation of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the first Geneva Conventions in the decade of 1860. No, this is something created by the impact of technology in wars that produce a scenario of horror and a massive murder scenario that pushed the beginning of this regulation. This was the task, and I will cross very quickly, of the Hague conferences of 1899 and 1907, the first concrete discussion of the control of biological weapons. No? This was the task of the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. What is very interesting, because create the first system to control the use of force. War was not prohibited, but war was put in a kind of situation on a system of controversy solutions, no? Where we first begin with arbitration, after that with the Committee of the League of Nations, and only in the end war would be legal, no? After that, with the Pact Briand-Kellogg of 1928, and after that with the Charter of the United Nations in 1945, war was prohibited. No, this is something important. The Charter of the United Nations do not use the word war. War is not even more a legal concept. The legal concept is use of force. No? War is a colloquial word, journalistic word that we can use as a synonymous of an armed conflict, but legally, the expression use of force is the correct expression. And the use of force, in the terms of the Charter of United Nations can be classified as lawful or unlawful. No? This is very important because it's the idea to be more precise. And when the use of force is lawful, in two situations. When it results from the decision of the United Nations Security Council. This is why it's strange that Russia, a country of the Security Council of United Nations, which is in charge of the possibility of a legal use of force, use an illegal possibility, because the other option that can define a lawful use of force is self-defense. This is why Vladimir Putin used the argument of self-defense against the possibility aggression of Ukraine with the aid of NATO. This is ridiculous, but this is an argument that fitted with the legal frame. If it's a question of self-defense, this is legal, and we can invade Ukraine as a preventive self-defense movement, no? And except in these two cases, the authorization of the Security Council and self-defense, the use of force is unlawful and considered aggression. The General Assembly of the United Nations in 1974 go ahead and approve the resolution 3314 of 1974, which defines aggression very minutiously, listing a series of typifying behaviors, thus giving content to what would be the illicit use of force. So, under current terms, international law establishes the characteristics of international policy acts aimed at international public security for the use of force resulting from a decision by the Security Council. There is therefore no need to speak of war or declaration of war, because there is not even more this possibility. Or the use of force is legal or illegal, no? And this is what we have today. The Cold War between United States and Soviet Union, both states holding veto power at the Security Council, severely reduced the Security Council's capacity to intervene. It is worth noting that between 1945 and 1990, with the dissolution of Soviet Union, the Security Council passed just over 600 resolutions. The same number passed in the 90s. In 10 years after the end of Soviet Union, there was the approval of the same number of resolutions on the Security Council that was approved in the 5 previous years. So the system that was built in 1945 began to go on, no? And the characteristics of these days until the invasion of Russia in the Ukrainian territory was based in this reality. Of course, we can discuss a lot of cases, particular cases. Each war is a war. We lawyers love to deal with particularities, no? But in general, we can understand that the system worked and began to produce effect. And now, now we are in this with this question that I put in the beginning, and now I'm finishing. What will happen? No, there is therefore a robust legal framework that expresses an undeniable advance in civilization. In about 100 years, we advanced a lot in terms of building this legal framework. The body of legislation is reinforced by the progressive strengthening of international jurisdiction. This is something new also, with the advent of courts that have demonstrated surprising vitality nowadays. The decisions of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court on the current conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East are a demonstration of this trend. Vladimir Putin goes nowhere because he is afraid of the mandate of prison that was put against him by the International Criminal Court. So, there is a threat on the horizon then, and I'm really finished, that military violence between states could spread and definitively bury this progressive sculpted legal framework. Trump could order the occupation of Greenland and Panama, as my colleague advised. China could invade Taiwan, what will be the logical consequence if Trump invade Greenland. And the next day, China will invade Taiwan and make the control of all the ships produced in Taiwan. No? Or Russia could use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. They talk about tactic nuclear weapons, but nuclear weapons are nuclear weapons, tactic or not. No? This would mean the prevalence of war and barbarism. But on the other hand, international society can press for the preservation of a regulatory regime capable of creating the conditions for the survival of the human species. This is the challenge of our time, and I expect that this seminary can answer this question. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for your interesting and challenging presentations. I am in the same situation as you are. That's the first time I hear the presentations. So I have no privilege in starting the conversation. That's why I'll just put some short questions. I'm not sure that the answers will be short, but they are short questions. And then I'll give the floor to you directly so that we can assemble some questions. We have like 20 minutes for that. So, Beatrice, you know, in my case, it would be natural to ask you about 2013, but I won't do that. I'll ask you about Ali Hochschild's work. She passed like 5 years among far-right extremists in the US. And she came up with a very similar point that you make, that the far right, or I mean, plural, radical right, does not recognize the practices of the state as a regulator of inequalities. So, and she uses a method called deep story. She's looking for the same connection that you are looking for, the interpellation and subjectivation. I don't know if you use this in Butlerian terms or in Althuserian terms, I don't know, but it's almost the same. But in the case of the deep story, the very question is, well, we stand here in line, and the state is regulating the line, and someone all of a sudden is cutting off the line. I would like to hear what you think about this aspect of Ali Hochschild's reconstruction. Karolina, I would like you very much to develop the last point you just mentioned. That is to say, if Trump is the other side of the post-traumatic sovereignty, that is to say that given post-traumatic sovereignty, if Trump is the guy that exploits this kind of trauma, and in which way you see his measures, because the book was published before Trump initiated this flooding of the zone, as they say, like the far right strategy is. And Pedro, I would like very much to ask you about the Security Council and the objective sense of Trump's measures, because I'm really astonished that I only read in the papers that Trump is a fool, that Trump is crazy, that his measures will hurt him, will hurt the United States. I mean, this kind of unanimity seems to me completely crazy. Just as when Bolsonaro came to power and everyone said he's dumb, he's stupid, he's a fool, he's crazy, and other things. So I don't think Trump is neither of these things. And I would ask you, given your presentation, if Trump's strategy, I don't mean the strategy of the guy, Trump, I mean the objective consequence of his actions is not to change all the power from multilateral organizations, from the General Assembly, from all the agencies of UN, from the BRICS, from the G20 to the Security Council? That would be my question. Because if you see Trump's measures, you can see that the point is Russia invades Ukraine, and then Trump takes a fight with China, and then France and the United Kingdom try to do something. So it's like the Security Council is the new forum for negotiation. That's at least my impression. I don't know what you think. So please, the floor is open for your questions.
Yeah. So thank you so much for, is it working? Yeah. Thank you so much for the really wonderful presentations. Also a very, very good start in this workshop. I have questions for Beatriz and also for Karolina. For Beatriz, somehow connected to Marcos' question is the question of the role of state, but putting from another perspective. So it's really like this, that the far right doesn't recognize the state as regulator of equality, inequality, because at least according to my perception, they actually very much claim for states producing and guaranteeing inequalities. In case of Germany, quite clear inequalities between rights for migrants and rights for nationals. So the state should be actually be there for protecting privileges for the nationals. In case of Brazil, in many situations, privilege of the white man, privilege of men, and so on. So meaning that they very much expect states for regulating inequalities in sense of protecting situations of inequalities. And the second question is connected to importance of violence for producing subjectivation, and also for producing political subjects. In case of Germany, so the violence against migrants, more or less accepted by part of the German society. In the case of Brazil, the case of guns you mentioned. So how violence is important for constitute the subject. And for Karolina, quite quick, just to turn your argument, let's say, inside the nation states. Because so this post-traumatic sovereignty is perhaps, you are observing, is perhaps a second wave, because the first wave is in the process of constituting national states. So if you think of, don't know, indigenous sovereignties, which actually were destructed for constructing national states, but also some level of sovereignties for national minorities, such as Kurds and other minorities in Europe, which disappear after the existence of the national states as constituted today. Perhaps, I don't know if you use this sort of let's say, turning your argument into the national state?
Yes, thank you very much. Beatriz, the first question is, I think it's obvious, but I would like to hear more. There are similarities between these young groups in Brazil and Germany. How do these similarities come? Where do they come from? Is it the spirit of the time? Is it social media? Is it like organized right-wing groups, international? Because it's very nice to see in your research the diversity, but of course some things are common. So I would like to hear more. And Karolina, thank you very much. It's in the same sense as Sergio's question. What about the groups that are not organized in a state form? So listening about post-traumatic sovereignty, one has to think about the Palestinians in 50 years in the last century, or post-colonial societies. From a Brazilian perspective, I can really see this concept being in work, but there maybe would be some tweaks or changes. Like, do you also think that it could be used in these societies?
Thanks for the presentation. Beatriz, just a short question. How do you understand the combination of that different clusters that you mentioned, and how do you use the cluster to organize something as, I know that it's a very plural agenda and it's a very plural radical right, but I know what is the borderline, because some of them are pro-guns, some of them are pro maybe abortion, and some of them even are monarchists. And I don't know, is it possible to organize the clusters something as a self-perception? Because you said, okay, they don't see themselves are a homogeneous group, even from a right-wing group. And how do you organize this? Because some of these agendas are parts of groups that are not actually from right-wing groups or radical far-right groups, you know. Maybe they are from more liberal ones, and they are common interests and agendas too. I don't know how to organize this and understand the identification of the clusters. Okay, thanks.
It's Mario for the last question for this panel, please.
Okay, thank you all for presentations. I have questions for Beatriz and Pedro. Beatriz, in the frame you showed of the categories, I think I did not saw the category of racism, migration, or anti-migration, xenophobia, and you were talking about Brazil and Germany. I would like to know if these categories were in your research and how. And Pedro, thank you very much also. You, I would like to listen more your perspective when you said will the legal regime will resist, the international regime will resist. What do you think about United Nations? The United Nations will resist on this scenario you presented to us. Thank you.
So I asked the organizers if I can give 5 minutes for each one. Okay. So please, in the order, Beatriz, please.
So quickly, I will just show you that because it was hard, I just present a part, but soon I will have like the book that is gonna be released. So you can see, because I just gave like a short overview of my research, but first, like answering, I had to choose the literature. So I'm honest that right now I'm trying to go deeper in US literature, but I focus on European. And there are a lot of good research made based on those, but we would need to go to the differentiation, and if it's worth it, to use the differentiation between far right and radical right. And one of the things that in the European context, they say that is the far right do not accept the majority rule. But I don't know if this is true anymore, especially after like the Brazil, the invasions in Brazil, the US also, the Congress invasion, also you have like threats of attack also in Germany. So this differentiation, I don't know if works anymore. I do not use this as a conception to differentiate it, but you have like lots of works about former extremists in far right, and they're including neo-Nazi groups and those kind of groups that I'm not including in my research because I need to make choices, and also based on the idea that they're not integrating in the liberal democracy. So I was interested in those process, how you get inside and you try to erode this from inside. Because if you're accept to be marginal and you say, okay, all the system not work for me, I think it's a bit different. And I think maybe I go to the question of Sergio that I was trying to say exactly this. Uh, the social justice appears as a coercive force. I think they are asking for the regulation of the state, but when the state acts regulating inequalities, they don't accept it. So in this sense, I'm not saying that they don't ask for the state some kind of privileges, but when the state are acting and providing social justice, they usually in their like the interviews, this is a coercion. This is the state cannot do that. So I'm trying to say that and not saying that they're not asking what they see the kind of inequalities. And of course I also following the work here in Cebrap and the idea that you have those groups coming from the into the public sphere, also trying to put some idea of injustice that they feel that they are facing. But I think we need to consider that when the state acts in terms of inequalities in both cases, they do not accept or not recognize it. And the importance of violence in terms of constituted the subject, I think this appears, I don't know, like the topic of violence and hate, it's really hard because sometimes I think it's hard to define violence and say, okay, are those uh, what I call it a political violence, what they are legitimating. But if you go further, what means that you want to have a gun at your place? Because you're saying like, especially in Brazil, and I think this is a huge difference that I identify, like in Germany, usually they call the state, okay, regulate the immigration. And you have like few cases like the identitarian movements that really call into violent actions. Usually it's like the state needs to regulate. But if you come to Brazil, and especially after the change for the hunters collectors, CACs that we call here, they asking, okay, we want to make justice, we want to circulate with guns. And this is something that for me was kind of shocking, that see that young people are also claiming, including female that I interviewed, that we're saying, no, we need to have guns to protect ourselves. So somehow you say, okay, I can cross the state because I don't believe the state. So this is of course a paradox. Sometimes they ask in the state, okay, go regulate because I want CACs legislation, but at the same time you're saying, I want this so I can break the law, so I can have the right to make justice with my own hands. And similarities, yes, of course, I try to point at some of them, like feminism, the idea of racism, but I think that it's manifesting in different ways. I think that these binary social representations are based on racism. In the case of Brazil, of course, against the poor and black. And if you go, what it's more complex, because in complex now, I will say what is different is because if you go to Germany, they have this concept of ethno-pluralism, this idea. So they are trying to move this discourse about a cultural racism. They are culturally strangers. It's not about ethnicity. They don't integrate. They are not part. So you have somehow you can still establish like an outside enemy because they're not integrated. And I think in the case of Brazil, the idea like the racism, and they are part of the society. So you have like this outsider, but you build this kind of binary social representations that are completely based on racism. So this I discuss in my in my book. So I think I just did not have the time. So it's okay. Yeah. After we discuss.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions. So very briefly to answer your question, Marcus, about the Trump being the other side of post-traumatic sovereignty. Well, I have been always very far from ridiculing populists. I believe that they have their political agenda and logics, and if they are ridiculed, it's very difficult to really analyze and stand up to them. So I would never say that Trump or Bolsonaro are stupid. I would rather say that what Trump represents is a different concept of a global order. So to put it very shortly, after 1945, I would like to think so, what you were saying, I would like to think that the global order with the United Nations and all those documents was basically based on an idea of self-determination of nations with borders, not perfect, of course, but still. Whereas this new concept would be a concept of self-assessment of neo-empires. So basically, it is a global order which is based on relationalities between neo-empires, and not relationalities based on law. So this would be a very short answer to that. It brings certain paradoxes which are interesting. Like, for example, I haven't mentioned in my presentation that the post-traumatic sovereignty in East and Central Europe basically has two faces. It's not only the face of being afraid of Russia. East Central Europeans are not afraid of Germany anymore because it's obvious Germany has changed, but Russia hasn't. It's also obvious. So it's not only fear of imperialist Russia, it's also the fear of being betrayed by the West, like in Yalta. And so you must know that after Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin met in Saudi Arabia, the reactions in East Central Europe in the public debate were like, oh, so now you understand how we felt in 1945. It was directed at French, Germans, and English. I think it's quite interesting and puzzling. What comes out of it, that's a different, perhaps longer discussion. And now, Sergio, actually to both of you, because this was a very similar question. Sergio, thank you very much for the question. Also, actually, for bringing me here. I'm very grateful. Yes, we in the new project, which the work title is the triangle of troubled sovereignty. We also want to include Israel-Gaza, or Israel-Palestine to be precise, which is a case of not only a state, but actually of two nations that step into the conflict severely traumatized, and they not only do not see each other's trauma, but they keep traumatizing each other. It's a conundrum that is, for a research, extremely telling, and I believe that we will have some important findings here. But probably also Israel-Palestine is also just one of the case studies. One might probably think that the Kurds that you, for example, mentioned would be another example again, and so on. But because these are not only two nations that are traumatized with the lack of their state and the consequences of it globally. Now I know that I'm breaking the rules a little bit, but I also had questions to the panelists. So very briefly, and if you don't have the time to answer, perhaps let's talk about it. But I just wanted to ask one short question to each of you, namely, Beatrice, you have mentioned that the radical right is eager to break the democratic agreement. But what they would say is that we actually did it first. That this is exactly what the Arne Hochschild, you can find it exactly there, that those people who allowed, for example, mass migration in a very short time, or allowed a huge liberalization of women's rights, this is actually, for them, this is already a breaking of the democratic agreement. And I'm not saying that I agree with this. But somehow there is this voice of Alan Kahan, who wrote in his book, Freedom from Fear, lately, there is something to it that the Liberal Democrats are not eager to discuss those difficult questions, like should we have such a big migration in such a short time? Or shouldn't we actually discuss more the moral issues connected with abortions? Why not? Yes, we can liberalize it, but why not discussing? So he says it's something that there is some fault also in the Liberal Democrats, and I would like you to reflect on it. And to Pedro, I have another question which you will be able to answer, namely, you said that the fact that Russia attacked Ukraine full scale in 2022 was strange. Why is it strange? I mean, Russia has been doing it for 25 years now. It's not something new. It reveals rather a certain hypocrisy of the global world order that we had after 1945. There were some nations that actually were allowed to attack Georgia or allowed to take Crimea. It's nothing new. So it's rather, we can still prefer the global order from after 1945, and I certainly prefer this order. But in order to repair it, we would probably have to put light on such elements of this global order. And would you have any answer to that? Thank you. I'm sorry.
Well, very quickly. Marcos, it's very difficult to to know what is going on in Trump's head, no? I was in politics for more than 20 years, and I always think that we generally superestimate the idea of strategy and planning of the governments. No, leaders frequently goes with his or her intuition and much less planned that we imagine and we try to understand. Generally, what I think that is in the mind of Trump, he's against the multilateral order, of course, and he's very clear about this for so many years that we can just believe in him. No? So what I think he's trying to build is a global governance, a kind of new Cold War, a Cold War 2.0, with China and the United States as the main partners in relation-based and conflict and agreement, no, as was with Soviet Union, no, and without the participation of the rest of the world, that will be divided in the countries in favor of US and the countries in favor of China. I think that this is something that goes on Trump's mind. The problem is that I don't think that this is possible anymore, because the solution of global problems demands multilateral approach. It's not possible to fight the global warming with this kind of bilateral division of the world, or pandemic, or the nuclear war possibility. It demands a multilateral approach. This is why I don't believe that this strategy of Trump in the end will have success, because the world is not fitted to be governed in this way. I wrote an article for when there was the pandemic for the journal of the Faculty of Law, saying that the affirmation of international law in context of crisis. Traditionally, in all the world crises of the last 100 years, in the first moment, there was the destruction of the multilateral order, and each country will be by itself. It was in the First World War, it was in the Second World War, it was in the AIDS crisis. And after each one of these crises, there was a responsive international law. No, the Treaty of Versailles, the Charter of United Nations, the Declaration of Doha on AIDS, and on the pandemic also. COVID-19, the first reaction was the close of the borders everywhere. No? I was deported from Uruguay. My wife is Uruguayan. I was there with the family in the frontier taking an ice cream, and two policemen approached and is, sorry, sir, the border is closed. You must leave. And I was deported. This is incredible, from Uruguay. No, it was the first time in my life. I went to Egypt, to Korea, everywhere in crisis, but I was deported from Uruguay. And what happens in the sequence? The revitalization of the multilateralism. Europe, because of the Brexit, was in the approaching of the collapse, rebuilt itself and approved the Next Generation program. It was one of the most important financial support programs for development in history, and Europe use it as the after day of COVID-19. No? And I think that we can discuss something. I finished with the reference of two facts of today that it's interesting for you to be in touch, because they have some kind of relation with this, the theme of the seminar, relationalities. The first one is the choice of the new Secretary General of United Nations. And Marcos, bad with United Nations, worst without. So we'll survive because there is a necessity to it. It's not just the war or the Security Council. There is a lot of programs, a lot of actions that without United Nations will provoke a collapse in the world order. So it will survive. The next Secretary General, in the tradition of the succession of continents, will be from Latin America. And President Lula is today in, I don't know if Honduras or Guatemala. It's the meeting of CELAC. CELAC is the Central America, Caribbean, and Latin America organization. It's very interesting because Brazil will propose to CELAC something that has been discussed for many years, that is the option for a woman as Secretary General of United Nations, a Latin American woman. There are a few candidates, possibilities. We discussed this a lot at the University of São Paulo, as something that not only because of the symbolical aspect, but in practical terms can be something new in the global governance. This discussion will be right now because the mandate of Antonio Guterres, the actual secretary, the current Secretary General, will finish next year. And the second information is the rehabilitation of the agreement between European Union and Mercosur. This was forgotten for many years, but last year, after the victory of Trump on the election, Europe began to change its position in order to allow the continuity of the negotiations. And on Montevideo, on December of the last year, the president of the committee, the European Committee, came to Montevideo and signed the agreement, and now there is a discussion on the Parliament European. Of course, Europe feels isolated in this conflict, in this 2.0 Cold War. And the perspective of a convergence between Latin America and Europe that has a lot of things in common, the democracy, human rights, can be a new fact to fight this idea of a new Cold War with the creation of a bloc that can be a third and very interesting option in this field. Let's see what will happen, but pay attention to these facts that are nowadays up to date. Thank you very much. During the